We hear about boundaries everywhere: podcasts, Instagram posts, therapy memes, and we nod along like, yes, I should probably work on that. But when we're actually in the moment, saying the boundary out loud feels impossible. Boundaries aren't complicated, but the thoughts and emotions around them absolutely can be. It can feel really hard for women, especially, to set and keep boundaries. We worry about disappointing people, being misunderstood, or seeming rude. But the truth is, boundaries are simply information about what we can and can't offer. So today, we're going to untangle the mental drama around them and build the skills that make setting boundaries actually feel like an accessible option so that you can finally feel in control of your own time and energy. I'm your host, Emily Shutt, a professional certified coach with over a decade of experience helping smart, driven women untangle their drama around money, relationships, and well being. I'm here to help you do the same using science backed coaching tools rooted in cognitive behavioral theory, positive psychology, and peak performance. You'll leave with actionable steps for approaching your own life with clarity and confidence. Let's get into it. So, when was the last time you felt that familiar internal, like, ugh, moment? The one where your mouth said, sure, before your brain had time to process? What was happening? I had a client, and I think many of us can relate, where she was extremely highly valued at work and often praised for her performance, but she was quietly burning out behind the scenes. She responded to requests at all hours, never leaving her phone unchecked, and always hooked to her email. Anytime her boss asked her to do something above and beyond where she was already going above and beyond, she just immediately said yes. And the same applied anytime one of her direct reports asked for something. It was always just a yes. It may come as no surprise that this also showed up in her home life, where she was just an automatic yes whenever anyone asked for anything, even if they could easily do it themselves. For everything from picking up groceries someone didn't add to the list when she was already doing the shopping for the week, or figuring out where their missing AirPods were when they had looked for themselves for less than, zero point 0.2 seconds. There were no boundaries whatsoever. And at first, it hadn't even occurred to her that those are areas that are even eligible for boundary setting. She thought her issue must be about time management and productivity when that was far from the case. She wasn't saying yes because she wanted to. I mean, she did on some level, but she was really saying yes because she didn't want to disappoint anyone or slow anything down or be seen as someone who couldn't handle it or who wasn't helpful. That is a huge word. And honestly, that's the part that so many of us miss. The yes isn't coming from desire, it's coming from pressure. And then we are creating that pressure for ourselves with our own thoughts. And it isn't surprising that she wasn't solidly capable of setting boundaries right out of the gate because it flies in the face of everything we're taught to value about ourselves as women. She had been praised her entire life for being dependable, helpful, accommodating, the kind of person who just handles things, no questions asked, no pushback, no complaints. So when those same traits started draining her, she didn't recognize them as boundary issues. She assumed that she was the issue. And I think a lot of women hear that and go, oh, wait, that's exactly what I do. Not because we're pushovers, but because we've gotten so used to being the one who smooths everything over that we forget that we're allowed to choose. And on some level, we like being seen that way because then we get to tell ourselves that we are good women. But those are all just thoughts. So for this client, her breakthrough moment wasn't when she learned a new productivity hack. It was when she realized she didn't actually have a time management problem. She had a boundaries problem, and that was something that she could learn to change. We can also do time management hacks, but that's not what we're talking about today. So after she had that realization, we started looking at all the tiny moments throughout her day where she was giving away her time, her energy, and attention without even noticing. And once you start paying attention, you realize this stuff is everywhere. It's not just the big asks that drain us, it's the small, constant, everyday boundary pushes that we've normalized as just how life works. For example, one of the biggest ones I see, both with clients and honestly with so many women I know, is people assuming we're available at all times. The quote unquote quick question slacks at 7 p.m., the group text that expects an immediate response, or the request that sounds small but actually derails your whole afternoon. We are so conditioned to respond right away that it doesn't even occur to us that not responding is an option. Like that feels like very radical. In friendships, it might look like always being the planner, always being the emotional support contact, always being the person who adjusts your schedule because someone else is running late or canceling plans at the last minute. And again, we just brush it off like, oh, I don't mind, even when we kind of do mind. And then there's family. This is where I see the most quiet resentment build up because we rationalize it as like, well, that's just how my family is. whether it's being expected to host every holiday or to always go to your parents' house when you want to stay home, or being the sibling who picks up the slack, or getting pulled into emotional labor that no one else is volunteering for. Those are all boundary pushes too. They are just getting disguised as tradition or politeness or obligation. In general, those are disproportionately put on women. That's not the case across the board. I'm not trying to make this a guy girl thing. Um, but in general, these are patterns that are pretty well recognized. So the biggest pattern across all of these is that we don't automatically name them as boundary issues. We label them as being helpful or being flexible, keeping the peace. And that's exactly why we stay stuck, because we can't change something that we don't realize is optional. And this conditioning doesn't come out of nowhere. If I look back at the messaging I received growing up, and I think a lot of women will relate to this, the messages around being accommodating and agreeable weren't usually explicit. Nobody sat us down and said, your job is to prioritize everyone else. It was more subtle than that. It lived in the praise we got for being easy or mature for our age or helpful, being responsible. It lived in the gold stars that we earned for being low maintenance, for not making a fuss, just going with the flow. And this isn't criticism of my parents. I have amazing parents and I'm lucky and I know that. This is more about noticing in your own life the messaging that you receive unconsciously from all of the adults around you. Maybe that's teachers, coaches, extended family, and so on. What messages were you picking up? Girls usually learn early on that being a good woman means being pleasant, accommodating, and ideally beautiful as well, being flexible, being the one who can handle things. If someone asks something of you, even if it's a huge stretch, the right thing or the nice thing was to say yes. Even better if you could anticipate the need before anyone had to ask. And of course, for a lot of us, this shows up in ways that get heavily reinforced by other adults around us. Teachers love it, bosses love it, family members love it, right? Who wouldn't? People reward you for being endlessly available. And we like the rewards, but we don't always notice the costs. Or if we do notice them, we try to minimize how we feel about them until it's really impacting our lives. And when that's the water that you've been swimming in your whole life, you don't realize that it's optional. Being agreeable isn't a personality trait, it's really a survival strategy. It's a way of trying to manage how other people feel so that you can stay safe or liked or needed. And it works until it doesn't, until you hit that point where you're doing so much emotional labor and logistical labor that you don't even recognize what your actual preferences are anymore. So when women tell me setting boundaries just feels selfish, it makes sense to me because on some level, we were told that being a good woman means being accommodating and selfless. And boundaries, by definition, disrupt that pattern. They introduce friction when we were taught that friction shouldn't exist or that it was our job to make sure that it doesn't. And that's why they feel so jarring at first. And again, I'm speaking generally about the socialization of women, but if you are a guy listening to this and you are experiencing some of this too, that is completely valid. It's really just to talk about, okay, regardless, what do we do about it, right? When I picture one of my clients in that split second before she sets a boundary or doesn't, her internal dialogue is almost always some version of, "Ugh, I really don't want to, but it will just be easier if I say yes." So there's this instant calculation happening in her brain like, what will they think? Will they be annoyed? Will this create tension? I don't have the energy to then try to diffuse because that's also my job somehow. And then 9 times out of 10, she decides that her own comfort is the most expendable thing in the equation. And they'll understandably rationalize it with, I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want to make this awkward, or it's not that big of a deal. Sometimes it's even, I should be able to handle this, which is code for, I don't want anyone to think that I'm difficult or unreliable. And then underneath all of that is fear of judgment, not in a dramatic way, but in that deeply human way where we want to be liked, respected, and perceived as competent. And we will do incredible things in service of that goal, even if we're abandoning ourselves bit by bit in the process. And the crazy thing is, this entire mental spiral often happens in less than a second. That's why it's not always obvious that our thoughts cause our feelings, because the thoughts happen so fast that they barely register, but we are always reacting to them. So, for a woman in this scenario, by the time she's aware of it, she's already said yes, even though she didn't necessarily want to. And she's almost like, wait, where am I? Because her brain is trying to solve for harmony and approval and efficiency all at once while also trying to downplay her own compounding despair that she knows she's going to have to give up something to accommodate yet another request. So the pressure to stay agreeable just feels automatic. So I have kind of a basic example. My husband and I have a system where he loads the dishwasher and I unload it. So this thing with the dishwasher works fine, but let's just say like I'm a little bit more vigilant about my part of the operation than he is. So there are times when the dishes stack up. And this used to be a huge issue for me because I obviously prefer that things are very clean at all times. So, what is my boundary in this case? I generally will not load the dishwasher because my job is to unload it. It's not anything vindictive or dramatic about like refusing to cave in and do his work for him or that he's trying to take advantage of me by not doing it as quickly as I would. That's actually not my default thought anymore. It used to be, and I think for a lot of people that actually is the default thought. It's about not interfering with his process for doing things he's already committed to in general, even if it's not the way I would do it. And I think, dishwasher aside, there are lots of areas of our lives where these themes come into play. Like someone says that they'll do something and they want to do that thing, but they're going to do it differently than you would do it. And I think a lot of the work there is around building that tolerance for just allowing other people to exist the way that they are. So I have to decide in that case, like, what is my own boundary and what am I willing to compromise on versus not? And by holding the boundary, I give myself back the time that I would have spent doing it for him. And I avoid taking away his opportunity to follow through on a commitment that he elected to take on for himself. So as I write this, I'm recalling that just this morning, as he was leaving for work, he looked at the dishes on the counter and was like, "Want to take one for the team?" And I just was like, "No, thanks, you got it." Right. This doesn't make me a bad wife or lazy or selfish or inconsiderate. And actually, there are probably people who think that, but I don't think that. I think that's kind of the point here is like the thoughts are subjective and we are in charge of cultivating the thoughts that are most supportive for us and our lives and the people in our lives. So those words are probably some of the first ones that pop into our minds when we hear a story like that. And the point is deciding to have those thoughts or react to those words is an optional choice. It doesn't have to mean anything about your actual value as a person unless you decide to make it mean that. So my response to my husband was not shocking. It was not a big deal. We both laughed. And I know he'll load the dishwasher when he's ready. And that's also not a big deal. Now, we've been together for over 15 years, and there was definitely a time earlier in our relationship when I would have completely spiraled out about how I should just do it and that I was mean or petty if I didn't, or I wasn't being a good wife. And then I would get mad that I was beating myself up and saying all of those unkind things about myself. And then I'd probably eventually find a way to take it out on him and make it about how he must not respect me or something. But none of that is helpful or necessary. There's no way to know what is objectively true. So this is kind of the point. Once again, we're navigating a very subjective situation of parsing apart optional thoughts for consideration. Boundaries in relationships aren't about controlling the other person. They're about staying in integrity with the agreements that you've made and giving both people a chance to contribute the way they said they will. So if you're finding over time that someone repeatedly can't meet that agreement, you just renegotiate the agreement while keeping your boundaries in mind. It does not have to be dramatic, but it will probably feel a little uncomfortable now and then, especially if our thoughts are triggering heightened emotional responses. So that's kind of what you're looking out for. An example of a boundary that seems tiny on the surface, but actually points to a much bigger pattern underneath is not answering a text immediately. So, for many women, if the phone buzzes, we feel this sense of urgency, like we owe someone a rapid response, even if we're in the middle of something, even if we're tired, even if we just don't feel like answering right that second. And again, this is not all people, not all women, not everyone feels this way, but I see it a lot. So when I ask clients, okay, but what would actually happen if you waited like an hour? There's this pause because logically, nothing bad would happen. But emotionally, it feels like we're breaking some unspoken contract about being a good friend or a reliable coworker or a thoughtful daughter. Like all the eldest daughters, raise your hand. So the small boundary, I don't have to answer right away, is really pointing to a deeper belief of I'm responsible for other people's feelings. Another one I see constantly is agreeing to attend a social event where you already know you don't want to go, but you don't want anyone to think that you're being rude or snobby. Again, tiny boundary, but underneath it is a belief that it's your job not to disappoint anyone and to make sure that everyone else is comfortable before you consider your own comfort. You might notice that it feels easier to justify declining an invitation when you have an obvious conflict. But when your schedule is open, you automatically feel like it's first come, first serve for everyone else but yourself. And the issue comes from thinking that you need to justify your decision or make others feel a certain way about it. but how others feel is not in your control. Sometimes I'll get asked what's the best strategy for navigating social exchanges like that. And of course, there's basic guidance for how to be clear and tactful in your communications. And that's something I cover with clients when working together. But I always have to remind them that even if you execute perfectly against an etiquette checklist, the other person is going to receive it the way they want to receive it, and you're not in control of that. I think that's the hardest thing for us to accept, but that is just what it is. These small boundaries expose the places where we've been trained to overfunction, over accommodate, and over explain ourselves. So, starting with these micro moments is one of the best ways to build confidence because they teach your brain, okay, no one died, nothing exploded. The world kept spinning even when I didn't respond immediately or go to that cringy mixer, like whatever it is that you don't want to do. That's the kind of evidence that makes bigger boundaries feel possible because even as the stakes increase, the fundamental principles are the same. So, like we talked about earlier, one of the biggest forces working against women when it comes to boundaries is the way that we're trained from such a young age to prioritize agreeableness, not just being kind, but being accommodating, pleasant, predictable, and easy to work with. And all of that gets reinforced over and over again as we age. You're praised for being so mature for your age, or such a team player, or the one you can always count on. And even though those things aren't bad in themselves, of course, without proper examination, they create this internal rule book that says that your value is tied to how convenient you are for other people. And that honestly is a nightmare. Another layer of conditioning comes from how we're taught to interpret other people's emotions. If someone is disappointed, annoyed, or even mildly inconvenienced, we absorb the message that it must somehow be our fault. I don't know if you've seen that meme on Instagram that's like the Alice in Wonderland thing, and the Mad Hatter or whatever is like, we're all mad here. And Alice is like, oh my God, at me. Right? Like we just sort of assume that we're always in trouble. So, of course, boundaries can feel threatening. We've been taught that emotional discomfort, even mild discomfort, is something we are responsible for preventing. And finally, there's the productivity layer, this belief that your worth is connected to how much you can handle without complaining, that you should be grateful for being busy, grateful for being needed, grateful for being the one who keeps things running. So boundaries challenge that identity because they require you to say, my time and capacity are finite and belong to me. And for a lot of women, that feels like failure. So when you put all of it together, the pressure to be agreeable, the responsibility for others' emotions, the expectation to keep the peace, and the identity of being endlessly capable, it makes perfect sense that boundaries feel hard because you are needing to unlearn decades of training. So that's what we're going to start doing now. A lot of the confusion around boundaries comes from the fact that we often think a boundary is something we tell someone else to do. Like, don't talk to me that way. Don't show up unannounced. Don't keep asking me for this. And those sound like boundaries, but they're actually rules. And rules can fall apart pretty quickly because they rely on someone else behaving the way that you want them to, which unfortunately we do not get to control. Again, I have tried. A boundary, on the other hand, is about your behavior. It's I'm not available for conversations about my weight, or I don't answer the door for uninvited visitors, or I will not keep responding to the same question I've already answered. It's you deciding what you will do to protect your time, your energy, and your well being, not trying to force someone else into compliance. You set the boundary and then you decide what you would like to do in response to someone, you know, not respecting that boundary. And the reason this matters so much is because when we confuse rules for boundaries, we set ourselves up for resentment. We think, I already told them my boundary and they didn't respect it, when really what we gave them was a rule. A true boundary is something that you enforce for yourself, not something that someone else has to obey. You get to decide what you want to do, again, what you're in control of if someone doesn't obey, quote unquote, the boundary. So that distinction is what gives you back your sense of agency because you're no longer waiting for other people to cooperate in order for you to feel okay. So when clients say something like, I tried setting a boundary with my mom, but my boundaries didn't work, this is usually why. It's actually a rule, not a boundary. So they've been trying to control someone else instead of deciding what they will do. So we're always kind of shifting it back to like, okay, what are you going to do? What is in your control? Other people are not in your control. So let's say that you were very brave, you decided the boundary you wanted to set, and then you communicated it. And then you kept right on communicating it. Like, let's talk about over explaining. Over explaining is one of the fastest ways to accidentally weaken a boundary that you're trying to set. When you tack on all the reasons and context and apologies, what you're really communicating without meaning to is, I'm not sure I'm allowed to do this. And people pick up on that, not because they're trying to take advantage of you, but because your delivery invites negotiation, which we have talked about separately. If you sound uncertain, Someone will interpret that as a suggestion, as at best, not an actual boundary, and you're trying to communicate a clear boundary. When you give a long justification, you're essentially asking the other person to agree with your reasoning, when the truth is they don't need to agree with you. You don't need a PowerPoint presentation to decline an invitation or say that you don't have capacity for something. A boundary is strongest when it's simple, direct, and delivered without apology. So don't be harsh, just be clean and clear. The more you explain it, the more space you give for someone to poke holes in what you're saying. Suddenly, it becomes a debate about whether your reason is valid enough from their perspective, instead of simply honoring your preference or your capacity and leaving it at that. There is no universal standard of what is a valid reason for something. It's just something that you get to decide. So don't let someone else decide for you. That's when the conversation spirals and when you end up doing the thing you didn't want to do in the first place because you talked yourself out of your own decision. It's about showing your brain and the other person that your boundary is intentional, not up for negotiation, and not reliant on them approving of it. So the shorter it is, the stronger it feels. The number one fear women have, generally speaking, when they set a boundary is that someone will be disappointed. And not even dramatically disappointed, just like mildly inconvenienced or thrown off or surprised. That tiny shift in someone else's tone or facial expression can feel like a siren in your nervous system that's like, abort mission, go back, fix it, just like do what they wanted. This is too hard. We're trained to interpret others' disappointment as a threat on some level. A close second is the fear of being misunderstood, that someone will think that you're being rude or selfish or cold or ungrateful or difficult, all of these like very triggering words that we are taught are extremely important not to embody. And for so many women, that fear hits way harder than the actual boundary itself. It's not the action that feels scary, it's the idea that someone might develop a negative story about you because of it. And then there's the fear of conflict, even on a micro level. So that momentary tension or change in the atmosphere, it's like the risk that someone might push back, ask a follow up question, or even express frustration. That's the scariest one. Like that tiny disruption feels huge because we're taught that our job is to keep things smooth for everyone. So here's what I want people to hear: someone else's emotional reaction is not evidence that you did something wrong. Their reaction is a reflection of their thoughts and their expectations bumping up against your autonomy. That's it. This is just part of the deal when engaging with other humans. And I wish it were different, but it's not different. Dealing with other humans can be hard. And non humans, come to think of it. So, one of my puppies, who has since passed away, had to go on a special diet for a little while. And she had a lot of big feelings about the change in food and snacks. But even though I'm sure she was not happy with me, I was not doing anything wrong. That's a little more nuanced because obviously I was in charge of what she ate and other people are not like in charge of you in that way or vice versa. But the boundary in this case was not giving her people food for a while. And she was allowed to feel upset about that. And that didn't mean anything bad about me. So if someone or some puppy feels disappointed or confused or even a little irritated, it doesn't mean that your boundary was unkind. It just means you're not always defaulting to accommodating their preferences over your own. And that shift takes a minute for everyone to adjust to, including you. And that's okay. So, one of the biggest mindset shifts around boundaries is realizing that other people's reactions are just that, reactions. They're not moral verdicts. They are not data about your worth. They're not even an accurate measure of whether the boundary was appropriate. Again, that's not a real thing. No one gets to decide that objectively. I can't tell you how many times clients have explained in great detail a situation where they had to enforce a boundary, and then they asked me if they were being unfair. There is no objective fairness test for a boundary because it's all about individual thoughts, which are inherently subjective. So when someone reacts negatively to your boundary, it usually has nothing to do with you being wrong. It has everything to do with their expectations being disrupted. So maybe they were used to you being endlessly available. Maybe they assumed that you'd say yes like you always have. Maybe they just don't like change. Like, who does, right? That discomfort is theirs to work through. It's not yours to solve for them. If we think about this from a cognitive behavioral perspective, boundaries are neutral. Someone else's story about your boundary is just that. That's their story. You don't need them to agree with your decision for it to be valid. The only evidence you need is that the boundary honors your capacity, your values, and your well being. Their feelings belong with them, your decisions belong to you. That's it. One of my favorite ways to help clients build boundary confidence is to start with boundaries that literally have no real consequence. The ones where the stakes are so low that the only discomfort is the discomfort of doing something new. So that's going to be things like letting a text sit for an hour before responding, even if you saw it. I'm actually doing it right now. Or not answering a call if you're in the middle of something, even if you technically could step out and take it. These tiny moments retrain your brain to understand that immediacy is not a mandate in most cases, definitely not for text messages. And these are very real exercises that I'll do with clients. And it's amazing to see that they'll literally be crawling out of their skin sometimes because they're so used to being hyper responsive. And it feels very uncomfortable to remove the phone tether. So if you're listening to this and thinking, that's not hard at all, even though you've never done it, I would say just try it. Sometimes we want to skip ahead to actions that seem bigger or more impressive, but it's the tiny, unimpressive activities that build the actual foundation for the bigger things. So it sounds impressive to run a marathon, but you cannot run a marathon if you aren't willing to run a mile to start. Does that make sense? I feel like I've used that metaphor before. It's fine. You might be able to pull it off once if you get lucky, but it's probably really going to hurt. So let's just train properly. Okay. Another low stakes boundary is ending your availability when you said you would. If you're at a social event and you told yourself you'd leave at 9, leave at 9. Even if someone says, "Oh, already," or tries to get you to stay. Like, this is exciting because you get to practice setting a boundary. At work, it might look like not volunteering yourself as the default helper. If your first instinct is to raise your hand to solve the problem, try sitting in silence and letting someone else go first. Not all the time. It's good to, be proactive, and definitely there's actually it just came out like objective research around having the opportunity to run or be involved in complex projects early on in your career is one of like the strongest indicators of career success later on in promotion and progression. So I'm not saying don't volunteer for anything, but I'm saying if you always volunteer for everything, try volunteering for like slightly less than everything. So you don't have to announce anything. The boundary is simply choosing not to overextend yourself when no one asked you to. And one of the simplest boundaries of all is pausing before you say yes. Literally a 1 second pause. It signals to your brain that you are making a choice instead of reacting automatically. That tiny pause gives you time to notice whether you actually want to agree or if you are just trying to be accommodating. These small boundaries don't look dramatic from the outside, but that's kind of the point. They create the internal evidence you need. Like, I can set a limit, nothing bad happened, I survived the discomfort. That's what makes bigger, more important boundaries feel so much more doable because you've already built the muscle. So here's the simplest definition of a healthy boundary. It is the point at which you decide what you are or aren't willing to participate in, and then you take responsibility for honoring that decision. That's it. It's not a demand, it's not a rule for someone else to follow, and it's not a test to see how much someone cares about you. It's information about your capacity, values, and preferences paired with the actions you'll take to protect them. A healthy boundary is one that is clear, concise, and grounded in self respect. If you can use that as your compass, like, what am I willing to do? What am I not willing to do? And how will I take care of myself if someone doesn't like it? Then you're already practicing healthy boundary setting. Yay. One of my favorite boundary scripts, and the one that I recommend the most, is simply, "I'm not available for that." It's short, it's neutral, and it doesn't invite debate. You're not apologizing or justifying or over explaining, you're just stating a fact about your capacity. Another one that feels really approachable is, "I wish I could, but I can't take that on right now." So it's still a no, but it's softer around the edges and a little easier for people who are newer to boundaries to say without panicking. If you want something even simpler, like in my example earlier with the dishwasher, there's always "no thanks" or "that doesn't work for me." These are incredibly effective because they're clear and respectful and they don't turn the boundary into a whole dissertation. And if someone pushes back, you can repeat yourself. Boundary scripts don't need to escalate. The most important thing is consistency. It's really no different from training a pet. If you're inconsistent, they won't know what the boundaries are and they'll be confused and frustrated because they don't know what their expectations should be. So if you're consistent, you teach yourself and others what to expect. So internally, my favorite, we'll call it like a boundary mantra, one I use a lot for myself is, "I get to decide what's right for me, and other people get to decide how they feel about that." It's simple, but it immediately anchors you back into what you can control and releases the part you can't. You get to decide your capacity, availability, and limits. Other people get to have whatever thoughts and feelings they have about that. And that part is not really your business and it's not in your control anyway. It's not for you. And those two things are allowed to coexist without you needing to fix anything. When you're in a moment where you feel that old pressure rising, the urge to say yes, the fear of disappointing someone, or the instinct to smooth everything over, this mantra creates a little mental space and a reminder that your only job is to tell the truth about what you can offer. And what I love about this is that it works at every level. So it works for tiny boundaries, like not replying to a text immediately. It works for medium boundaries, like declining a last minute work request. And it works for the big life shifting boundaries, like resetting the dynamics in a relationship. The mantra doesn't change the situation, it just changes the interpretation of the situation, which is where all your power actually is. So the next time you feel the familiar guilt or anxiety creeping in, try repeating it to yourself. Again, I get to decide what's right for me, and other people get to decide how they feel about that. It's the cleanest reminder that other people's thoughts are theirs to manage and your boundaries are yours to honor. Now, I would be remiss not to touch on how important it is to also respect other people's boundaries. This goes both ways. Respecting other people's boundaries is really about giving them the same autonomy that you're trying to give yourself. So it means taking their no at face value and not trying to persuade or guilt trip them. It means not making it personal when someone protects their own time or energy. And it means allowing people to have limits that are different from your limits without turning that into a commentary on the relationship. You get to decide, to what extent you'd like to engage with someone who has different boundaries or limits than you do. You're in charge of your interpretation of that. And again, I would always choose what is most helpful and supportive for you, but it doesn't have to mean anything that you are not already deciding. So in practice, this is going to look like not pushing after someone declines an invitation, not assuming that you have to get an immediate response just because you reached out. It's accepting when someone says, I can't talk right now, or I'm not up for that. And if that feels hard to accept, practice reframing it as that they are taking care of themselves, not rejecting you. It has nothing to do with you. And here's the thing, respecting other people's boundaries actually makes it easier to set your own, because when you stop personalizing other people's limits, you start to understand in your body, not just intellectually, that boundaries are just information. And the more you normalize that in your interactions, the safer it feels to offer the same clarity in return. So, building the skill on both sides creates relationships with way less guessing, less resentment, and a lot more honesty. It makes room for everyone to show up with choice instead of obligation, and that's where the healthiest dynamics always come from. Most of us avoid setting boundaries because we think they create conflict, when in reality, the lack of clarity is what creates conflict. Or the boundary, while that's simply naming what's already true for you, then you have conflict within yourself that you're not honoring it. So we're not looking to change the relationship, you're just telling the truth about it. When you shift your mindset to start viewing boundaries as clarity instead of conflict, everything gets easier. It doesn't feel easier at first, I will admit that, but over time, this is easier. You stop worrying about being mean or dramatic because you understand you're offering information that ultimately helps both people be clear. So you're removing guesswork. And the second piece of this mindset shift is remembering that your preference is a valid reason. You don't need a crisis level justification to set a limit on something. Saying things like, I'm not available, I don't have capacity, or that doesn't work for me are complete explanations. That's a complete sentence. Setting boundaries isn't about becoming a different person. It's really about becoming more honest with yourself and the people around you. So start with the smallest, lowest stakes place you can practice, and then trust that the skill grows with you. You don't need to do it perfectly. If boundaries feel uncomfortable at first, that's okay. That doesn't mean you're doing them wrong. It means you're doing something new, and it's normal for it to feel weird. Remind yourself that you're not in charge of how other people feel about a boundary, even if you wish it were different for them. Other people are in charge of their own thoughts and feelings, just like you are in charge of yours. So go forth, set the boundaries, live in peace. I hope you came away with some insights you can apply in your own life right away. I'll see you next time.